The wind cut sharp across the open prairie that morning, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and the faint iron tang of the storm that had passed through the night before, and as the wagon wheels creaked slowly along the rutted trail, little Annie clutched her mama's hand tighter, her wide blue eyes staring out at the endless horizon that seemed to stretch on forever with no promise of an end, no whisper of shelter, no sign of mercy. Her mama, pale and thin from weeks of hardship, tried to force a smile, brushing a strand of hair from Annie's cheek as though her touch alone could shield the girl from the harsh truth, that the oxen were failing, the water was almost gone, and her husband, Annie's father, had left them 2 days ago with the hollow promise that he'd return with help, though in her heart she knew he wasn't coming back, not anymore. Not after the way his eyes had turned hard and empty the night he walked off into the darkness with nothing but his rifle and the last of their bread, leaving her and her daughter behind on that godforsaken trail like burdens he no longer wished to carry. The sun rose higher, cruel and merciless, burning through the thin fabric of their bonnets, and with each passing hour Annie's mama grew weaker, her steps slower, until at last the wagon lurched to a stop on a patch of cracked earth where nothing grew, and she sank to her knees with a soft gasp, pulling Annie into her arms and whispering prayers with a trembling voice that sounded more like a goodbye than a plea for deliverance. Annie cried then, the sound carrying across the emptiness, a sound too small and too pure to belong in a place so desolate, and it was that cry, thin, desperate, yet stubbornly alive, that reached the ears of a man riding the high ridge above the trail, a man who had long ago given up on the world offering him any reason to hope, a man known only as Luke among the few who still remembered him, though most called him simply the rancher because that was all he seemed to be, a shadow of a figure who tended his cattle alone in the hills and spoke little to anyone. He reined his horse to a halt, narrowing his eyes against the glare of the sun, and there he saw them, 2 figures collapsed beside a broken wagon, one woman clutching her child as though to shield her from death itself, and something stirred deep inside him, something he thought he'd buried years ago when he laid his own family into the cold earth after fever swept through his homestead and left him with nothing but memories and silence. He could have turned away, could have told himself it wasn't his fight, that the trail was merciless and always had been, but as Annie's cry carried again on the wind, thin as a thread yet unbroken, Luke tightened his grip on the reins, muttered a low word to his horse, and began the slow descent toward the trail, toward the woman who lifted her head with eyes full of both fear and hope, and toward the little girl whose fate, though she did not yet know it, was about to change forever. Luke dismounted slowly, his boots striking the dry earth with a weight that seemed to carry years of loneliness, and as he stepped toward the wagon he caught the look in the woman's eyes, half terror, half pleading, because in a land like this a stranger could be either salvation or ruin, and she had already been abandoned once by the man who swore to protect her. Annie clung to her mother's dress, peeking out with wide, tear-stained cheeks, and Luke's throat tightened in a way he hadn't felt in years, because that child's gaze held both innocence and the unbearable question of whether she would survive another day. He tipped his hat respectfully, his voice low and steady as he said, "Ma'am, looks like you're in a hard way, let me help if you'll allow it," and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of a promise, the kind a man made only when he intended to keep it. Luke grabbed a canteen from his saddlebag, pressed it into her hands, then crouching down to offer Annie the first careful sip, watching as her small fingers wrapped trustingly around the tin cup, and in that moment, something within him softened like dry earth touched by rain. The woman, who gave her name as Clara, could barely muster a nod because her lips were cracked from thirst and her strength was rapidly failing. However, the relief in her eyes was clear enough to indicate that he knew he couldn't leave them here, the trail would swallow them whole by nightfall, and he couldn't carry that on his conscience, not when he'd already buried too much. So he hitched their broken wagon to his own horse, gathered what supplies hadn't been spoiled, and told Clara and Annie that his ranch lay a day's ride west, where water still ran clear and there was shelter to be had. Clara hesitated, fear of the unknown clashing with the certainty of death if she stayed, but when Annie laid her head against her lap and whispered, "Mama, can we go?" she knew the choice was no longer hers alone. They set off together, 3 unlikely souls bound by desperation and a spark of fate, and as the trail stretched out before them under the burning sky, Luke felt something stir in his chest he thought he'd never feel again, the sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to spend the rest of his days alone with his ghosts, because sometimes salvation rode into a man's life not in the form of riches or land, But in the cry of a child and the courage of a woman who refused to let go,